This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And so I want to give a special thank you to William Gosling and Allison M., who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon, and to Brian Howry, who just made a one-time contribution to the show via PayPal. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 386 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new movie Terminator Dark Fate, directed by Tim Miller and produced by James Cameron, director of the first two Terminator films. Dark Fate, which is the sixth movie in the Terminator franchise, is a direct sequel to the 1991 film Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and features the return of Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor. And this will include spoilers for everything in the movie, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got Anthony Ha, making his 15th appearance on the show. He covers media, advertising, and pop culture for the news site TechCrunch, where he also hosts the podcast Original Content. His short story Late Train appears in the February issue of Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, and you should all go check out his TechCrunch article, Somehow Dark Fate Got Me Excited About Terminator Again. So Anthony, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Then next up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, also making her 15th appearance on the show. She's a Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in Connecticut with a Renaissance engineer, a dog, and a bird. So, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
And also joining us today is Rafael Jordan, making his 10th appearance on the show. He's written over 25 feature films that have premiered on video and cable television, including The Immortal Voyage of Captain Drake, Star Runners, and Vampire Nation. He also co-wrote the new series Salvage Marines, starring Casper Van Dien and Peter Shinkoda. So, Rafael, welcome to the show.
I knew I'd be back.
All right, so let's start off with Anthony and have you just tell us about what is your history with the Terminator franchise?
I think my earliest memory of it is, just seeing commercials for the first film, like on local TV, because I feel like it was in constant rotation in the late 80s. And I remember just seeing the commercials of Arnold Schwarzenegger, basically slaughtering an entire police station, and that just completely traumatizing me. Yeah. And it really created this, I think it was like years before I actually had the courage to watch the movie. And I think probably, I wouldn't be surprised if I may even have seen the second one first. But, roughly in, let's say, late childhood, early adolescence, I saw both of them, loved both of them. And I think have seen both of them, a number of times at this point. And the other sequels, each time I would be kind of interested, and then the reviews would come out and I just would not be that enthusiastic. And so the only other the only follow-up that I really had exposure to was, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, which I watched and liked a lot. But I haven't seen any of the other film sequels.
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that you were too scared to watch Terminator, because it's a little hard to even remember this now, but the first Terminator movie is as much a horror movie as it is anything. And there were seriously parts in that movie as a kid I would have to just close my eyes. I couldn't watch him, like where he rips the guy's heart out or whatever it is at the very beginning, or where he, especially when he's doing surgery on his wounded eye, I could not watch that for the longest time. I'd have to cover my eyes.
Mm-hmm. I think that is definitely true, although I think it also just speaks to how these things sort of exist in our minds, even separate from the movie itself. That I remember watching and liking the movie and probably being frightened by it. I think for me, the big striking thing was just seeing the, the metal skeleton at the end chasing them through the factory. But, for some reason, the commercials, probably because I saw them when I was younger, stuck with me more than anything, particularly in the movie itself.
Right, and then the sequel is much more of an action movie. I mean, I love them both. I mean, I've seen both those first two movies dozens of times, but it's kind of interesting. It's almost the same thing as Alien and Aliens, where you have one that's more of a horror movie and then one that's more of an action movie, and they're both great, and the second one kind of ups the scale of it. And And it's interesting that those two franchises from around that same time both kind of followed that same pattern for their first two installments.
Right, and both with James Cameron as a director for at least one of the films.
Yeah. So we should say, so James Cameron directed Aliens. Ridley Scott directed Alien, but then he wrote and directed both of the first two Terminator movies. It was based on his idea. I mean, he basically did everything. It's actually funny, in one of the special features I watched, it was talking about how James Cameron was just basically better than everyone on the crew at their jobs. And, like, he was better at special effects than the special effects guys and like everything. And so he found it just intensely frustrating that people weren't all up to his standards and was just, yelling all the time and everything. But you can see, I mean, they're so good. I mean, especially if you go back and rewatch, I went back and rewatched a lot of Terminator 2, and it's just so well done. Just all the action scenes. I mean, it just makes your heart pound, and the special effects all still look great. And it's always clear what's happening, and it's, it really captures the emotions of everything. And, this is just like movie making at its finest, as far as I'm concerned, Terminator 1 and 2. But so how about Sarah? What is your background with the Terminator movies?
Well, I was actually completely obsessed with James Cameron when I was a teenager. Again, I was
so was James
homeschooled.
Cameron, so that's kind of
yeah, so, I mean, obviously, in the 90s, like, the thing is, James Cameron has this really charming idea of feminism, and his only real issue with that is that he hasn't really updated it since the 90s. I mean, when I saw, Alita: Battle Angel, it felt like a wonderful movie to watch in 1995. And it just felt like it came out in 1995, other than the effects. I found the script to Titanic 2 years before it came out for sale. So I spent 2 years worried about it before it came out. Because back then, there wasn't the internet, the spoilers weren't really a thing, and so you could literally just go into a mall, and there would be these vendors, and you could buy scripts to movies that hadn't come out yet. But, his sort of strong female obsession thing, that, and it wasn't just like, I think that unfortunately there's sort of this strong woman thing that it ends up being this commercialized, like, Megan Fox happens to know how to repair motorcycles thing. And it's always like this super sexualized idea of a strong woman. And James Cameron's women were not really that. And so I resonated with that very deeply. And I loved The Abyss. I loved Aliens. I loved, the Terminator movies. And so I was very, very much, it was a very formative part of Sara Michener's upbringing.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of my all-time fondest movie memories is watching Terminator 2 in the theater, and there's the scene where they're in the elevator escaping from the mental asylum, and Arnold Schwarzenegger says, "Get down," and then he's shooting at the T-1000, which is on top of the elevator, and Sarah Connor grabs the pistol out of his belt and starts shooting, and the whole audience just started cheering at that point. And at that time you had never seen female characters who were that proficient with firearms and tough and all that kind of stuff. So it was really it was new and fresh at that time. So how about Rafael? What's your experience with Terminator?
Well, like you said, it's definitely a sci-fi horror film, and it scared the hell out of me as a kid. I remember my older brothers indoctrinated me, and it's just so tense, especially at the ending where he's chasing them down at the factory. And even when she's crawling through the crusher thing and it's chasing after her, to this day, I have a tough time watching that. It's just too damn tense, and also makes me claustrophobic. But then, I was John Connor's age, more or less, by the time T2 rolled around, and it was just such a great spectacle. Like you said, it really upped the ante. And, at the time, too, I was just Guns N' Roses was on top of the world, at least for me. I was obsessed with Slash and Axl, and they put out the theme song to that movie, and Arnold was even in the video. So, man, summer of 91. I specifically think of Summer of 91, and I think of Terminator and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, but mostly Terminator and Guns N' Roses.
Well, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was also about the same age as John Connor when Terminator 2 came out. And, as you even growing my hair, long over the like my bangs long over my face. And I remember one of my friends saying, like, you're just copying John Connor. I'm like, no, I've been doing this for a long time. But I was totally copying John Connor. And Edward Furlong he's like the fucking coolest 12-year-old you've ever seen in that movie. He's like so charismatic and, just effortlessly cool. And sort of a shame he didn't have more of a, career subsequently. I gather he was sort of partying a little too hard, but he's so, and especially like I usually can't stand child actors in movies, but he's so good in that.
You definitely just wanted to hang out with him and his friend at the Galleria, like ride on their moped. I did. I was like, man, these guys are cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I noticed nobody's really mentioning Terminators 3 through 5. I mean, Anthony said he never actually saw them. Did you, Rafael? Did you ever? I assume you saw Terminators 3 through 5.
Oh, yeah. I've seen them all multiple times. And honestly, I'm probably the closest thing to an advocate for them. I mean, I think they all have their charms and they're all flawed in various ways. And I think that's, I don't know how much we'll get into each of them or the franchise as a whole, but there's a lot of fun inconsistencies and time travel paradoxes to bring up across the films. Yeah,
but so we'll say, James Cameron wasn't involved with the third, fourth, or fifth movies. He had sold the rights to the, as I said, he had come up with the story and written the script and everything, and he had sold the rights to it to the producers in exchange for them letting him direct the first movie. And so then it's
they don't exist for me. I just like the aliens that came after 2. I've written them out of some of the Prometheus ones have been good. I don't know to talk about that, but I think that they were nice, forgettable, disposable action films that you see once and you buy popcorn and then that's it. But to me, they're not like part of the Terminator story.
Yeah. So I mean, he had. I've seen conflicting things online about whether he wanted to make a third one or didn't, but in any event, he, went on to make Titanic and then all his other movies and wasn't involved with the Terminator movies after that.
I think once he made Terminator 2, I think he knew on some level or realized eventually he needed to make a third one because he really kind of opened up a can of worms. The first film is a perfectly contained closed loop story. But then the minute he changed his mind and said, well, maybe fate is malleable and not completely elastic and we can change it, well, then he kind of just went down a rabbit hole that there's no escaping from.
Yeah. And especially, I mean, I don't think any of the time travel stuff in 2 makes really any sense, and the more you go into the series, it just makes less and less sense. So I'm not even gonna harp on that too much with this new movie, but yes.
That's what I'm here for. Don't worry.
But yeah, I'm not at all fond of 3, 4, or 5. I actually think that Terminator Salvation, which is set in the future and is about the future war, at least is kind of, visually, I think is quite striking, and at least is sort of trying to do something different. But Terminator 3 and Terminator 5 just have way too much sort of goofy humor for me, and I are not horror at all, and I'm not really a fan of those. So Rafael, out of 3, 4, and 5, which one would you say is the strongest?
Well, I guess I had to have to say the third one, Rise of the Machines, because I feel like if nothing else, and you're right, the comedy was already instantly a little dated when that came out. Some of it was over the top, like the sunglasses and talk to the hand. But I think the one thing that it did that was imperative was it ended the trilogy correctly. Like Judgment Day had to happen. And so if nothing else, it accomplished that and set things right. The fourth and fifth had their moments too, but, Genesis, I actually really appreciated how they were trying to essentially put a twist on everything, with the revisiting events from the past, but the timeline had been irrevocably altered. But admittedly, that got so complicated, you'd kind of needed Doc Brown with a whiteboard telling you what was happening, and, people's eyes were glazing over. So I think that with this one, obviously, they streamlined it and pulled it back. I think the most interesting thing about the original T3 versus this one is that it reframes the story. With Terminator 3, the original, it was John Connor's continuing story because he was, the leader and savior of humanity. But with this one, what I really enjoyed was it kind of reframed it as Sarah's story. Like, it makes a nice trilogy now out of the Sarah Connor story.
Yeah, and let's come back to that. But I mean, I don't really know what to say about 3, 4, and 5. I mean, like, I guess, did you guys see, I sent you all the, what's the guy's name? John Brancato or something? Yeah, so he, this is a guy, he worked as a screenwriter on 3 and 4, and they took some of his ideas for 5. And so he wrote this long post at one point just talking about what a clusterfuck all these movies were. And I don't know, Sarah, what was your reaction to reading that?
I almost didn't want to. I mean, I read it out of curiosity after the point where he said he hated T2.
Yeah.
Like, as soon as he said he hated T2, I was like, what? What is wrong with you? Like, and so that really tainted everything else that he had to say. But then it was just, it was just this sad, cynical description of what goes on in Hollywood when everyone's just desperate to make a sequel because it's a cash cow and nobody gives a shit whether it's good. And it's like they need to figure out at some point that audiences can tell. Like, whether or not they can articulate it is another thing, but it always works out that way. Very, very rarely, I feel like, do studios go in saying, we're just going to do this to make money, and everybody in the cast clearly doesn't care, and, in the production team and so on, and the writers are just sort of hacking things together, and it magically turns out okay. If people don't care, if the writers and the directors clearly don't care about what they're doing, and don't have a vision and a passion, it shows all the time.
I mean, I guess, to be honest, I would probably take issue with that. I mean, just because I feel like, yes, at the very top, it's always a business decision and it's cynical, like the studio wants to make money, obviously. But then once the jobs are handed down to the various cast and crew, everyone on board wants to make the best movie possible. I mean, even though he did sound incredibly bitter and cynical, I could see between the anecdotes where he, obviously when he was hired, he wanted to make a good story because he really loved the first one. And I understood his complaint about the second one because it was always kind of my complaint too. It kind of let the story off the hook by implying Judgment Day might not happen. So I do think, obviously Jonathan Mostow, when he made Rise of the Machines, wanted to make a really good movie. And I think it's a decent movie. It gets kind of overly ragged on. I mean, it's a 2.5-star movie, but the first 2 are 4-star movies.
Well, I mean, the thing that, maybe you can explain this to me, Rafael, working in Hollywood, but the thing I never understand is, like, yeah, I always get the sense that, like, the special effects people and stuff are really into it, and they're always like, oh, I spent 6 months sanding this, like, rock that's going to be in the background of one shot that, like, no one's ever going to see. And then the screenwriter's like, yo, man, like, my friend called me up and was like, we need a script by tomorrow. And I was like, fuck, I'm wasted. But I sat down and I wrote something, and it's like, why is there so little effort put into the screenplay, which is the most important thing, when so many people on the crew are just pouring their heart and soul into the visuals and things,
Well, I can try and clear that up a little just in my limited experience. I've never worked on a film as big as Terminator 3 or 4 or 5, obviously. In general, what happens is you wait and wait to get a job, and then the minute you're hired, it's an extreme rush. There's never enough time, and that's the unfortunate thing, because the minute they call you, I mean, this happened to me with even Salvage Marines to a degree. That show that you mentioned in my intro. Essentially you get a call and they're like, hey, so we're finally greenlit and we really need the script immediately to secure the bond and the financing. So can you give it to us like in a week? And you're like, what? You're like, no. I mean, it's like, I can give you something in a week, but are you going to guarantee I've got time to fix it and make it right? And sometimes you get that time, sometimes you don't. So that's kind of the inherent catch-22 with the process, is oftentimes by the time movies are moving forward, they need the script yesterday. And yeah, I've experienced that, and it sucks. And I think that's probably what Brent Cotto went through.
My opinion that's a terrible way to do things.
It is, but it's not for lack of trying. It's like you always, trust me, like these writers are pulling their hair out, and sometimes, they're sequestering themselves in hotel rooms for 6 to 8 weeks if they get that luxury, but they're definitely like trying to make it better. It's just, it's such an uphill battle for quality always.
Yeah, and it's not really clear where you, like, Terminator 1, it's like, a human soldier versus a robot killer, and, to protect this human woman. And then it's like, okay, well, Terminator 2, we're going to have, like, the cyborg robot versus this awesome liquid metal robot, and protect the kid, and, and it's like, it sort of, like, flows logically from the first one. And then it's not at all clear where you would take the story after that. And you've seen like Rise of the Machines, Terminator Salvation, Terminator Genesis, and now even Dark Fate are all sort of like different stabs at where you take the story that are all, some of which are like clever, but none of which have the same sort of like, oh, that's the logical next step, at least to my mind, as Terminator 2 following from Terminator.
I mean, that's a really good question. I've been actually, as I was waiting for this phone call to happen, I was sitting here drawing like timelines on a piece of paper. I'm like trying to make sense of the movies. And I kind of found myself, the more I tried to make sense of it, like questions would pop into my head just about Terminator 2. Like who even sent back the T-1000? It's because they had changed the timeline. So it's like, I was trying to think to your question, what was the next logical step? And I think Dark Fate probably comes closest because it's like they've essentially just got this inevitability of a robot uprising and all you can do is postpone it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll say, like, I actually hadn't even seen Terminator Genesis, until I was getting ready for this panel. And so I was not planning to see Dark Fate at all. I thought the trailer just looked like they were rehashing Terminator 2, and I wasn't that excited about it. So really the only reason that I saw this movie at all is because Anthony on Twitter said, just got out of a screening of Terminator Dark Fate. Didn't know the person next to me, but as the credits rolled, we both turned to each other and declared, that was awesome.
Now you're just furious at me.
Well, we'll get to that. You have Anthony to thank for this panel. But so Anthony, so you tell us about seeing this movie early, because this was like a week or two before it came out.
Right. So I went to a press screening, and it was on an IMAX screen in Lincoln Center in New York. So I think I saw it under probably pretty close to ideal circumstances, and I think like half of it was, reviewers and critics and entertainment journalists, and half of it was just Terminator fans, and it was just a very rowdy and excited audience. And so I think even when I saw it, I could sort of explain that I had reservations and saw shortcomings in the film, but I think I just walked out of that screening just really buzzing with excitement and enthusiasm. I remember somebody in the lobby was just humming the Terminator theme song. Like, it just felt like, I don't know, especially because the trailers, I agree, the trailers had been really bad. And so I walked in with very, very low expectations. And I think particularly also because I really liked that final action scene. I really just walked out of being like, that was so much fun. I had a great time. And since then, I think some of these reviews, the critical response has been a little bit more mixed than that. And the movie isn't exactly setting the box office on fire. But I do think like I stand by, at least. I think that my initial response had a little bit to do with the circumstances and just that sort of initial buzz of seeing the movie. But, I also think it was a really good time. Yeah.
Well, it's funny how the circumstances can affect your perception of a movie like that. Like, when Sarah and I saw Star Trek Into Darkness, it was a similar thing where I think we saw it on IMAX, and it was like half the audience was dressed in Starfleet uniforms and stuff. And it was an amazing time, and it felt like people who didn't see the movie under those same circumstances had a much less enthusiastic reaction to it. But
for sure.
But yeah, so let's talk about the opening of the movie. So we start out, and it's not that long after the events of Terminator 2, because Edward Furlong, John Connor, is still like 12 or something, and he gets killed by some other Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator model that's wandering around. And so Sarah, what did you think of that opening sequence there?
I was very nervous for probably about a half an hour after that, because one of the things that I hated so much, and why the Alien 3 and all of the other Alien films after Aliens don't exist for me, is the start of Alien 3, they kill off two of the main characters that survived all of this stuff in Aliens, and it's like they could have just gotten off the ship and said, okay, well, I'm never doing that again, and then went home. And it was such a disservice and so disrespectful to the previous story and to the audience who loved the previous story to do that. And so I was like very worried that they were going to do the same thing here and just kill him off for no reason. Just because he was an extraneous piece of plot. And they did not do that. It ended up being a very big part of the story, a big part of the emotional development and the character development. And so ultimately I approved of the decision.
Rafael, what'd you think of that?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting, bold way to go. I mean, truthfully, I thought it was a dream sequence at first, and then after the second shot, and she's holding him in her arms, I was like, "Wow, holy crap!" They really killed off John Connor. I think I was reading some comments by Tim Miller after, and I think they made the right choice there because basically, it's interesting that like John and Sarah both, by saving the future, kind of robbed themselves of their future in a way. John was supposed to grow up and be this great guy, but it's almost like the Bill and Ted conundrum. What if you don't grow up and fulfill your destiny? Well, then what do you do? And he said, no one wants to see John Connor doing something truly mundane, like being just an accountant or something. And I think by killing him off, it actually probably was the right thing for the story because then it allows Sarah to continue. And basically, makes her story that much more tragic and engaging to me.
Yeah, I don't have a huge problem with them killing him off at the beginning because, it's like the sixth movie. They got to do something different. Like, I get that. But I felt like having him die as a 12-year-old, as Sarah was saying with Alien 3, kind of undermines the effect, like the emotional impact of the ending of Terminator 2. You're like, they went through all this stuff, and then he just dies shortly thereafter in very sort of like a not a very dramatic way. So yeah. I think it would have been better for me if like there's sort of the voiceover from Sarah and she's like holding John in her arms and he's like 22 or something, like they've managed to survive for a long time, and there's like it's night and there's flame and smoke and the Terminator's walking away having just killed him. And so like that you have a sense that there was like some sort of more epic struggle, that he didn't just die easily, but that the fact that he lived for so long after the end of Terminator 2 would have. I guess there was. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I guess there's two reasons. Well, actually, funny. To your first point about why was he still 12? It took place 3 years after the end of Terminator 2. I thought, he would have been a little older by now. Maybe they just thought it was easier to make him look exactly the way he did in terms of the CGI. I don't know. He should have been like, at least 16 or 17 by then. But I guess logically, he needed to die relatively soon after those events because the implication was that there was already additional T-800 Terminators wandering around looking for him. They came from a future that was never even going to happen. And this is all part of how I was trying to wrap my mind around the timelines and see if it really made sense, almost as a screenwriting exercise. Obviously, I think the only way it makes sense is if the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator that killed John, he had to have been around during the events of T2. He just wasn't seen on screen. So it took him 3 years to catch up to him in Guatemala, basically.
Right. I'm just saying it took him 10 years to catch, They managed to stay off his radar for 10 years, but finally he tracked them down.
Yeah, that definitely could have worked.
My interpretation was that, because I think part of what you're getting at is this question of how can Terminator still be showing up even though Skynet, as we know it, has been erased by the events of Terminator 2. But I think the way that time travel is implied to work in Dark Fate is that they were all sent from this future, and so they are still showing up in this timeline, even though the future they're sent from doesn't exist anymore, because it's not just the T-800 who kills John, but it sounds like periodically these Terminators are showing up, throughout the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and Sarah Connor is is tracking them down and killing them. So I don't think it's like a bunch of Terminators who arrived before the beginning of Terminator 2. I think they were all sent from the Skynet timeline and then continue arriving.
Well, it's an interesting question, and they were admittedly vague about that, because it was one of the biggest question marks I had after was what are these Terminators that she's hunting down and killing? Like, who are they trying to kill? I mean, in the interim, like John was already dead, so what were they after? I almost feel like...
No, but like, I think the idea, and Anthony, you're right about that, in the future that they sent like 20 Terminators back in time staggered over 20 years or something, all assigned to kill John Connor, just and like one of them's gonna get him. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's what the
and I
implication
thought that was a great decision because it was almost a commentary on, apps that constantly don't work and technology. The whole idea that this technology would be perfect, that it would be performing perfectly with an awareness of what happened in the new past or whatever is implausible, right? So I love the idea that it's almost like a glitch. That the original program was like, let's send 20 of these back in time every 5 years to try to kill the guy just in case. And that way, if anything does happen, and the timeline is altered, we continue to do our thing. And since these are disposable machines, that is very in sort of in plot in terms of how they think about just being totally okay with the disposable army. So I really loved that decision.
Yeah. But like I said, it didn't make any sense in T2, so I'm not going to worry about whether it makes sense in T6.
Well, I'll give you another one. It doesn't even really make sense that it's the Arnold version. It should have been another T1000, because if we're going off, the T2 timeline, at that point they weren't sending back T800s anymore, but they needed it to be Arnold, or they wanted it to be.
Yeah. So I'm not. I feel like that's just like a rabbit hole that is not going to produce any, like valuable insights or anything. Because it's like they did it because they wanted Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movies. I don't think that there's a whole lot to elaborate beyond that. But so let's move on to the new Terminator. So in this one, the evil Terminator is a Rev 9, which is sort of like the TX from Terminator 3, except that it's monomolecular, or polyalloy, I don't know what, forget, whatever it's sort of like liquid skin stuff, can operate independently of its endoskeleton body. So Anthony, what did you think of that villain?
I liked it. I mean, I agree that, to your earlier comment about not necessarily following logically from, if you think about the way T2 built on the first Terminator, I agree that, well, again, not having seen the sequels, my sense is that none of the sequels, including Dark Fate, has found a way to really top the T1000. I feel like there's something just so perfect. And I know you weren't just talking about the villain, but certainly part of that is, I don't know, that really was pretty close to the platonic ideal of a Terminator villain. So this is an interesting variation, and the visual, I think, is very striking, and it definitely sort of makes for some interesting action scenes because you've essentially got two different Terminators with one brain going after them. I wish they'd done a little bit more to explore the powers of the Rev 9, because I felt like, in a way, if both halves behave the same way and have the same strengths, I don't know why it's not just split the whole time. And so I thought there was room to maybe differentiate it a little bit more, but as just, a villain that feels like I haven't,
they have clashing personalities or something.
Or more they had have complementary powers or something like that. That the
tag teaming.
The soft version, is really good at insinuating himself into certain situations, but the skeleton is there for brute strength or something that made it seem more distinctive.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, I did like in Terminator 3 how I think they tried to make the TX too many different things, it can change shapes and it shoots laser beams and all this stuff, but its really distinctive power is that it can infect less sophisticated machines and control them remotely. Mm-hmm. And I thought that the whole movie should have forgotten all the other stuff that was a less good version of T2 and just focused on that, because I thought that was actually a pretty good original idea, or an original concept for a Terminator. But so Sarah, how did you feel about the Rev 9?
I was fine with it. It didn't bother me. I think the main thing that bothered me about the film was that a few times it veered too much into Mission Impossible territory. There's this whole chase scene and don't get me wrong, I understand that the genre of the Terminator, what makes it a Terminator, is the whole movie's supposed to be a chase scene. But the whole, having a fight on the plane in midair while it's falling, and then
Yeah. Okay.
the
Wait.
Humvee...
We're getting ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, but so the
I agree
reason
with
that
you, though. I
relates
hated
to...
that, but we're gonna get to that in a little bit.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, splitting the Terminator was one of those things where it's like it would always, 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 always be more effective if it has the ability to split. It would always be able to get more done by being two entities. And that, to me, made zero sense. Other than that, I really loved the look of it. I loved, the fact that they were almost trying to, wink, wink, say, well, one of them is from T1 and the other one is from T2. And so there's this weird marriage. But yeah, I mean, it had it complicated things and that it created its own plot holes. But other than that, I liked how it looked.
Well, it's interesting that you say that Terminator movies are one long chase scene, which is true on one level, but it was actually striking to me when I went back and rewatched Terminator 2 that there are really only two big action sequences in the first 90 minutes of the movie, and all the rest of it is character development. And if I have really a complaint about the early stages of this movie, it's that I felt like there wasn't enough character development at all, particularly of the sort of new John Connor type character who's Danny.
Well, chase might be the wrong word, but more like hunting. Like even during the character development, they're being hunted the whole time, and you feel that sense of tension.
Right, but so what do you think, Sarah, about that? Did you feel like there was enough character development? So the new let me just say, so the new characters are Danny, who's a young woman living in Mexico who works at a some sort of car factory, and then there's this soldier from the future sent back to protect her, Grace, who has sort of cyborg enhancements and can fight really well for short periods of time, but then her body kind of crashes, which actually I thought that was super cool. But what did you think, Sarah, about the character development? Did you feel like you got enough character development for those characters?
I feel like you got enough that you desperately wanted more, especially it does make it very obvious that the parts of the film that were extraneous and just over the top did feel like throwaways, where it's like, well, you could have had 30 extra minutes of the good stuff, and instead you went with this. But I think that, all three characters, all three women characters, were very well-rounded for how much time they had. But yes, I wanted more, but I think that I was overall very impressed with how they handled that, because all of them were, old Sarah was super compelling, and both of the young women were also very compelling, and you felt deeply for them.
How about Rafael? What did you think of those three female heroines?
Oh, I loved all three, especially Mackenzie Davis and Linda Hamilton. I thought they were fantastic. And in terms of the character development, yeah, I thought Grace came across pretty well written, and I enjoyed her scenes in the future, and I really wanted to spend more time with her. Danny kind of got the least time, but I guess if they make more installments, she'll be around for that. Quick note about the Rev 9, though, just because it didn't get mentioned. Whenever it would split into two parts, it was less effective. So that was why it didn't just do that all the time. Like, you could clearly see that especially the outer liquid metal shell was not particularly effective. Like, Grace was just getting the better of it every single time. So it was much stronger when it was together.
Okay, noted. I'll say about Grace. I mean, I thought she was pretty cool, but I thought there should have been more character development, particularly as it goes, we find out that she was a child before the new Judgment Day. And so it just seems like, she's coming back to this world that she remembers from her childhood, where there's like ice cream cones and, all this like nice stuff. And it didn't seem like there were ever any moments where she's like, oh my, and her parents are alive and everything. It didn't seem like there were really any moments where it dealt with what would it be like to, to live most of your adulthood in this destroyed world and then come back to this world that's a comparative paradise that you remember from your childhood. I just felt like there was a lot they could have done with that.
True.
But I don't know, Anthony, you have anything else you want to add on any of this stuff?
No, I mean, I would agree in general that I think the character development felt a bit abbreviated, and I mean that Danny in particular, I thought kind of got short shrift. And there's some specific reveals about her that I think weren't handled very well. But I was also, given the general framework of the movie where it was so action driven, I thought both Sarah Connor, I mean, who does have the advantage of, you know, the past movies, but also the Mackenzie Davis character, Grace, like came across really, really distinctly and as really compelling characters for me. And I thought Dani was fine. She just didn't make as strong an impression.
See, I feel like Dani did. I mean, the thing is, like, part of it is that the reveals are not shocking at all. You know they're coming, right? And so part of the reason why you know they're coming is because they show Dani early on as being a wonderful leader, but in a very feminine way, like in a very matriarchal way. Like she is literally making lunches for her brother and her father. She is going to the manager of the factory where she works, and not only, you know, saying, I want my brother to have my job, and he's uncomfortable with that because she's better at the job, and you're making all these connections as a viewer. Well, okay, why is she better at her job? And she is, you know, telling the manager, well, I'm gonna go out there and tell all these workers that they are just gonna be, you know, she's tough. She's literally threatening the manager to tell on him that they're all going to be replaced over the next few months. So I did think that they did point out that she was a natural leader, but they did it just enough to make logical sense. But at the same time, you knew that it was her, not her son. Like you knew the whole time.
Was there like a single 8-year-old in the audience who was thrown by that? You know, like it was just like even from the trailer. I mean, I feel like even from the trailers, you knew that it was her. Like, who's going into this movie who's not going to immediately pick up that Dani is not the mother of the leader of the human resistance, but is herself the leader of the human resistance? That whole thing just seems like a complete waste of time. That sort of red herring to me.
Well, and that one dialogue that they had on top of the train, where Sarah, you know, is in full bitter mode, and she is talking about, oh, you know, you're clearly the mother, you're just a womb. That conversation, like, cemented it for me that was what they were going to do, that they were going to do the opposite. And so it would have been better, I think, if they hadn't had that conversation. That said, I think I understand why they did it. Like, the whole thing is a commentary on, you know, sort of this feminist message that we've all been talking about within the feminist community of, you know, she's not somebody's mother, she's not somebody's sister, she is her own savior. And so I appreciated that was there, but from a storytelling perspective, it made it very clear what they were going to do from there.
Yeah. But so, I mean, you mentioned, Sarah, that the action gets ridiculous toward the end of the movie, which as I said, I 100% agree with. But in the early stages, I thought the action was quite well done. You have the freeway chase, and then you have the Rev 9 sort of slaughtering its way through the border patrol.
I loved the beginning, the action,
whatever you call it,
and setting it in an immigration center was wonderful. I loved that.
Yeah, detainment center, whatever you would call it. But so I mean, the action and like the fight between Grace and the Rev 9 where she has the big sledgehammer or something. There was like the action, and I was pretty into, like, as I said, I wasn't crazy about the prologue thing where John Connor dies, but and I thought there should have been more character development. But once it got going with the action, I was like, I'm pretty much into this. It's not as good to me as T2, but it's like, you know, it's not. You know, it's sort of within striking distance. You know, it's I was pretty into it. Does everyone agree with that? Was everyone kind of like on board with this movie up through the border patrol stuff?
I loved the action until the plane got involved.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that I thought, and I mean, I don't want to like overstate how politically smart or brave the movie is, but like there was something about just the fact that they were, you know, crossing the border illegally and they didn't make a big deal out of it, that I was like, oh, this is not something I was expecting to see in this movie. And then everything that happened at the detention center, yeah, I thought all of that was great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love that. And I mean, because I mean, you know, the franchise has a sort of connection with Mexico and, you know, Spanish speaking characters and stuff. You know, it wasn't like that felt sort of artificially inserted into it. You know, that sort of was a natural outgrowth of characters and themes that had existed in the earlier movies. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I actually wish they would have done a lot more with it. My my pitch for this movie is that it should have been like Terminator meets Sicario. It should have been like the whole thing, to my mind, should have been in Mexico and dealt with, and there should have been like a big shootout between Border Patrol agents and cartels with like Terminators mowing people down. It would have been so cool. And I think that like crossing the border should have been the climax of the movie. And then, when they get across the border and they're sort of safe, and that's sort of the end of the movie. Because I felt like for me, the movie really peaked in the middle. I felt like the border or the detention center stuff, like I said, I was into it. Up to that point, I was really enjoying it. And then the movie just like really kind of fell off a cliff for me after that point.
Sarah Connor will never be safe in America, though. Like she's wanted in all 50 states.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, there could be some plot reason why Danny is safe.
Just give me a hard time.
But yeah. So I'll just say, like, for me, the movie, I kind of like the movie kind of lost me when they meet Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I love Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's great, but I already saw him as like the good Terminator in 3 other movies. And, it's just like, it's been done. I hate the corny humor. And I felt like once he enters the story, it kind of becomes like much too focused on him rather than developing the relationships between the other characters. And like everything that he does already happened in Terminator 2. And a lot of the stuff I just thought was silly. So, I don't know. Does anyone... How about Rafael? I think you probably disagree with me about that, or?
Well, I get where you're coming from. It's kind of analogous, perhaps, to Han Solo showing up midway through Force Awakens. A kind of the movie was one thing and then it becomes another thing. But he's just so likable. Like old Arnold in that role, and it was kind of like he played it as Pops in Genesis. But this. For me, admittedly, as a writer, I'm coming at most of this, and I enjoyed everything that was presented on screen, but I kind of had questions after. I found myself just asking a whole lot of logic issues about, I'm glad they at least addressed the elephant in the room. Like, didn't she notice you're 400 pounds? And then I'm thinking to myself, how's he even sitting in that little lawn chair?
But then he has to say, like, no, our relationship is not physical. And it's just like so hard to take it seriously, like, when that kind of stuff is coming up.
I guess it's entirely possible that they just had a platonic, nice relationship and, living off the grid together. I don't know. I mean, to me, I didn't have any issue with it specifically, except for like my big issue with his character was how he knew about the Terminators. They kind of waved it off in a sentence. He's like, oh, I felt the ripples across time. And it's like, what? Ripples across time.
Wait, like, Sarah has something she wants to say about 400-pound robot sex.
Yeah.
Well, I really liked the older Arnold character, and I think it's part because there's some social commentary there that is what those scenes are more about. Like the idea of, honestly, a lot of women would love to have a non-sexual relationship with a husband type who was that kind. And especially somebody who had been abused, somebody who had gotten out of, a bad relationship and just wants to take care of her son. So that whole thing was very touching to me and in a very genuine way. And it did to me feel like a new, exciting thing to do with this character, because we've seen, in the first Terminator, Arnold was just a killing machine. In the second one, he sort of became more and more humanized in a very short period of time because of John. And then so the idea that the third one would be this guy who, was stuck on Earth after fulfilling his mission and had to figure out what to do with himself and be exposed to that kind of socialization and over decades. To me, that was fascinating. I loved that. But I do think that there was a lot more social commentary, in terms of why it would be totally plausible for a woman to be in that relationship with him, and that it just kind of worked. And for him to be hanging draperies, and at one point have a ridiculous, wonderful conversation about, what the right drapes are. And so I really loved the mix. And to me, it definitely also felt like you could kind of see the Deadpool every now and then. Like every now and then the whole, it's Tim Miller, is that his name?
Yeah.
Comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh, okay, this is that bit. And he's sort of enjoying it. Like he's enjoying, messing with the camp. So there are a couple of scenes that went too far.
Let's
but
get
overall, I really loved
Anthony back in here. Anthony, thumbs up or thumbs down on Arnold Schwarzenegger in this movie?
I'm gonna say thumbs up. I recognize the problems, and I think that they're shoehorning him in, and they have to get all this exposition across very quickly. So I agree that it's sort of, the scenes feel kind of clumsy and the writing feels clumsy, but I think the idea of the character is really compelling to me, again, of this Terminator who, I mean, isn't programmed to be a protector, but is programmed to be a killer, and has done this thing that, you know, from the audience's perspective, from Sarah's perspective, is completely unforgivable, but has had 20 years to outgrow that programming and to mature and to, you know, find its own direction. And so, I mean, a lot of that has to be conveyed in very, very few lines. And so it doesn't completely work, but I think I bought the idea enough. I bought the performance that, Arnold was giving, and what it also brought out, from Linda Hamilton, that it worked. I found it all very charming. I mean, I recognized the sort of machinery kind of creaking to make it all work, but it did work for me.
Yeah, and to Sarah's earlier point about not just killing John off for no good reason, I think, you know, that was the payoff, essentially. Seeing old Sarah and the old Terminator and having had that shared history and trauma was really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you had to do it, when I saw the trailers that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to be in this, I assumed it was a cameo. You know, that they go to the cabin and they meet Arnold Schwarzenegger and he, you know, tells them whatever he tells them, and then they go on. I didn't think he was going to join the cast. And I think probably anything, you know, positive to my mind about his inclusion in this movie probably could have been, you know, incorporated into a cameo. But I don't know, it sounds like I'm 3 against 1 here. Nobody thinks that. Does anyone think that it could have just been a cameo and he didn't have to join as the fourth musketeer or whatever?
I guess my response to that is that it has this sort of plausibility issue of, I mean, I remember watching X-Men Days of Future Past, right? And they bring in Quicksilver, and then he's the most powerful person, and then they're like, "See you later. We're gonna go save the world now." And I think there's a risk of that here too. But on the other hand, this movie has so many implausible things that they could probably have gotten away with it.
No, but see, it could be anything. Like his power cell is running out, or he used to be fighting the Terminators himself, and then he got damaged by one of them, and that's why he started sending Sarah to do it and stuff like that. I mean, you could come up with some reason why he can't leave the cabin with them.
To be honest, I thought he would be in the movie more. You know, I thought they probably split the difference pretty well. But in terms of having a cameo, I've got a good one for you. They should have gone into the cabin. It should have been him hanging out with 12 other T-800s. They were just sitting around watching football because they had nothing to do. I mean, you tell me he was the last one that the very last happened to kill John? No, there's got to be more of them.
Mm.
I do think that one of the things that made it work for me is that he was very fatalist and he wasn't just, socialized to be human. He was very aware that his purpose is ultimately to die fighting this again. And I think that added a kind of gravitas that created much more believability in the character, that he had this very fundamental understanding, that he was there to ultimately contribute back and catch up to pay for his mistakes, essentially. But, I mean, again, the character was totally about non-toxic masculinity, and I love that.
Well, I think what Rafael's saying about the relationship between Sarah and the Terminator, and she has to, he killed John, and she has to come to terms with that and forgive him or whatever. I mean, I think that that's potentially interesting, but I feel like the problem is that in order to make that really work for me, you would have had to have devoted a lot of screen time to that. And once you bring him into the mix, you've got Danny, you've got Grace, you've got Sarah, you've got the Terminator, and there's just sort of this diffusion of whose story is this and who's got an arc. And I felt like in the end, really nobody had an arc, right? Grace is pretty much the same from beginning to end of the movie. She's already fierce and everything at the beginning of the movie. Sarah doesn't change that much, and the Terminator is already nice at the beginning of this movie, and he's nice at the end. And so, like, somebody needs an arc in here somewhere. And so
I would say that Sarah has an arc.
I think they all do.
All right. Well, let me just finish my thought, and then you can respond. But I mean, I feel like what the arc should have been is that Sarah has devoted her whole life to John, and even after he's dead, she can't let go of the idea that he's the savior of humanity. And she sort of resents it. She sort of resents this idea that Danny is now the savior of humanity, and sort of gives her a hard time and is like, you're not measuring up to John. I trained John his whole life, and he was good at all this stuff, and he could save us, and you're just like half-assing this, and you're not up to my standards and everything. And then over the course of the movie, Danny proves herself to her, and and Sarah becomes like her surrogate mother figure for her, or Danny becomes a surrogate daughter figure for her. And I think
that would be so disappointing for me if that is what had happened.
I feel like that is what happened to some degree, because to the scene that we talked about earlier on the train, Sarah is clearly a little resentful and bitter towards having been replaced by what she perceives as the new mother to the savior. But by the time she realizes that Danny is the savior and becomes her mentor, surrogate mother, I feel like she's come around to her. So that was definitely
it's there, but it's there in like two scenes. And I think that, in order to make me care about it, there needs to be more character development. Like in T2, there's like so many scenes between John and the Terminator, like talking about life and everything,
I agree with you wholeheartedly in the sense that, like, I'll try not to go off on a tangent, but I feel like I agree with you. Everything that was on screen, I enjoyed. But for instance, they could have cut out the whole airplane sequence and given us 20 more minutes of character development, and it would have saved $20 million. Because they need to figure out how to make these movies for less. It's a real problem.
Yeah, well, given the box office so far, they probably needed to make it for like 150 million less. But,
well, exactly. I mean, I don't know if you saw, I wrote a whole long rant about that this morning on Facebook. Because the thing is, these movies are making 400 million at the box office. The last three and this one's on pace to do the same. And so they need to figure out how to make them for 100 million, not 200 million. Because the idea that the audience isn't there is just wrong. I mean, the audience is there. The studio can't figure out a way to make these financially viable. And so they keep hitting the reset button, and it's wildly infuriating.
Yeah, and it might be cheaper, too, not only would it be cheaper, but it might just look real, like it's really happening. So, like, okay, we don't need a C-64 cargo plane blowing up. We can just have a truck. Like, it was fine
exactly
in Terminator 2, but
we don't need it to be Fast and Furious or Mission Impossible. Like you say, I mean, honestly, it was actually giving me flashbacks of The Mummy with Tom Cruise, which was not what I wanted to be thinking about in the middle of that movie. Like the Terminator is just about like the chase, like Sarah was saying. And I guess they were trying to take that into the air, but just keep it on roadways and back alleys, and that's fine,
Yeah, but I don't want to get away from Sarah. She was going to tell me how wrong I am about my rewrite.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. No, I mean, I think that there are tropes that are established in terms of what women or female characters do to each other, and the idea of making Sarah Connor into this sort of bitter, old lady who's mad at the young woman would just have driven me insane. I would have not been happy with that. And so to me, it's like Sarah Connor is wise enough that she is not going to go there. And that's why she didn't. Like in the beginning, she immediately was protective of Danny because she saw herself, and she said that this woman is me. And she's just assuming that means that Danny is going to become the mother to a leader, in part because, Linda Hamilton is from a different generation. And, it's like watching Hillary Clinton talk to AOC. And so this idea that, so you don't want to have these women sort of artificially, pitted against each other for shallow reasons. She's old enough and wise enough to know better. And so trying to make it about John, or trying to make it like she's already, like she understood that the price of saving the world was John's life. She has buried it. She's dealt with it. She drinks a lot because of it, but she's accepted it. She's accepted the darkness of that. And so I found that that's part of the believability of this old, wise woman. Like she's very rough around the edges. She's a little crazy, but she's very wise. And that's what I wanted to see out of the character, and why it was so satisfying for me to watch her truly grow up and evolve and change.
Okay, wait. So, Sarah, you said you thought all four characters had an arc. Like, what are
Yes.
those arcs?
Okay, so Dani starts out as a natural leader, but she's not strong about it. She's not, and she doesn't have confidence in herself about it. She's just doing it because it comes naturally to her, right? And then she has to kind of turn those natural leadership skills into a more into an exoskeleton instead of the inner strength that she has, right? And so that's why she teams up.
She
at
needs
the
to
end
develop
with
her
Sarah
liquid
Connor.
metal.
She needs to take
covering.
ammo training. She needs to go through all the training that Sarah Connor went through. Only Sarah Connor did it by, quote, shacking up with any guy who she could learn from, right? And so Sarah, I think we already, have established Sarah's arc, right? Have I already explained that?
No, say it again.
Sarah's arc is that she has had to learn to deal with this bitterness. And learn to accept the fact that she did save the world. She really still feels good about that. It's clear that she still feels good about that. But she also recognizes that she did it at great personal cost. She had to save the world, and her son had to die. And the Terminator, the Arnold character, his arc is that he had to become socialized, and not only socialized in terms of how to behave like a human, but learn to feel in the limited way that he can. And
but that all happened before the movie. Like, does he have an arc in the movie?
You infer that by the things that he says. You see that growth from the killer we already know. We don't have to see that, because we already know what that looks like from Terminator 1. We already know what the beginnings of that look like from Terminator 2. So they didn't really need to do that. We already know how that process works. It's just nice to see it reach that fruition where he is an old man who has learned, sort of reprogrammed himself to have wisdom and to have a sense of real deep guilt for what he's done.
And how about Grace?
Grace, I think, is too young to have as much of the arc as the other characters, but I think that she is so devoted to Dani in a very T2 kind of way, the same way that the Terminator was devoted to John, because she sees that as her mission, and she sees Dani as like her mother. I mean, Dani saved her in this future that she's from, and so her whole thing is about protecting Dani and loving Dani. And so she doesn't really necessarily have to have much change so much as she needs to be, consistent to that. And the fact that she goes through and is able to save Dani, that to her is quite enough. She is, perfectly happy to give her life for Dani. And then in the end, it's a wonderful scene where, she sees, young Grace. Dani sees young Grace in a playground. And she says, I don't want her to die for me again, or something along those lines. And so the love was returned from Dani, which I thought was wonderful.
So, Anthony, what do you think? Do you think the characters grew and changed enough in this movie, or they needed to grow and change more?
I would say that it was less an issue of the amount of growth and change and more that, I think that the seeds of almost everything that Sarah is talking about were there, but that it was mostly abbreviated.
Yeah.
And I think the mitigating factor for me was the fact that I thought Sarah Connor was such a strong character that the character work that was really defined by her relationship with each of these characters, with this robot that's killed her son, with Grace, and to a lesser extent with Dani, I thought like that was interesting. I thought, Sarah making peace with what's happened, and to an extent accepting, the death of her son. I thought that was like all reasonably effective. And so, the other in terms of like Dani's growth, and I thought like, it was a little bit, she kind of faded into the background, I thought, for the second half of the film. And so it made it a little bit tough to be as fully invested in her. But I thought there was enough there that I didn't think it was completely unsatisfying. But even hearing, the description there of all the different arcs, I mean, you get this feeling that it is all these different stories kind of jostling for attention. And so it's, I guess, to a certain extent, it's to what extent are you willing to do some of that work in your head and let, the performances and the weight that some of these actors bring to these characters do some of that work for you.
I think we can all agree, too, that 30 minutes of the airplane should have been character development. Whether you think it needed it or not, it definitely didn't need the whole plane thing.
Yeah, well, and also the like random general or whatever who was willing to give Sarah the fugitive wanted in 50 states an EMP device, like that whole thing just like...
Oh, I forgot about that guy.
And especially since then the EMP device just gets shot up and they don't end up using it anyway. It's like, who thought that this needed to be in this movie? Like, no.
I mean, it needed to be there to set up the ending, but yeah, I agree it was not elegant the way they did it. I mean, that guy just shows up out of nowhere. I mean, the pitch meeting, I don't know if you guys watch pitch meetings, but they're hilarious. Yeah, he made fun of that moment.
It's a humorous thing on YouTube.
Yeah, it's like, the guy just shows up and we get no explanation about their backstory, how they know each other, where he got the EMP, nothing. So that was a little weird.
Right, but they end up just using Grace's power cell or whatever. So like,
right.
What did they need?
But I think like to kind of get the audience prepared for that moment, like to have the initial plan fail kind of sets up the secondary plan because it was the same concept.
And to have the moment where it's like the thing that we've worked to try to get and that is supposed to be the MacGuffin that finally kills this unkillable machine, to have it be destroyed, I think that like increases the sense of tension and desperation in that final action scene.
Oh yeah.
After the plane sequence that apparently no one else liked.
Oh I like the airplane scene. It was just extra. But I agree with you totally that last scene at the dam was just sensational. And I thought, I can't wait to honestly watch all three films back to back because I feel like it really is the culmination of everything. Like that's in that moment, the fate of humanity is on the line. They have to keep Danny alive, and this thing just seems unstoppable.
Yeah, I want to say, I mean, maybe my favorite scene in the movie was actually the part in the future where Grace is wounded, and you just see like what the Rev 9's like allies look like when they're not trying to pass for humans, and they're like so creepy, and they like the liquid oil kind of flows off them and forms all these tentacles, and they're just stabbing people. Like, I thought that was pretty damn cool, and sort of reintroduced the horror elements into the franchise, which I feel like is sort of sorely lacking
for sure
ever since the original Terminator.
And here's the interesting thing about that, though, David, is it certainly seemed like it was a losing fight, right? Like there was no way to beat those robots. It was almost kind of like Edge of Tomorrow. They were just dominant, right? But clearly there is a need because the whole concept of the film is Legion or Skynet or whoever it is feels like they're going to lose, which is why they're resorting to time travel to try and kill someone in the past.
Yeah,
I just find that interesting because I guess in future films we'll see more of that. I almost,
to be honest, there's going to be future films.
I mean, I'm hopeful, and yet I'm also fine if there isn't because I think like we finally went out on a relative high note that most people can agree on, and I also think it finally split the difference between T2's optimism and T3's cynicism in a satisfying way because it's like essentially now the moral is Judgment Day must happen. The world will end for a time, but humanity will eventually prevail. And that's that's as good as you're going to get with this series.
Yeah, and I mean, the critical consensus seems to be that this movie is substantially less good than T1 and T2, but substantially better than 3, 4, and 5.
Right. I mean, because I think like T1 and T2 are just such hollowed classics at this point. You're just never going to equal them, and you would need James Cameron's deft touch, which frankly he probably doesn't even have anymore. It's been a long time, and Avatar wasn't as good as Terminator 2 either. So who knows?
I guess I want to come back to one of the topics I want to bring up is I mentioned at the beginning that there's like Terminator and Aliens, and both franchises have struggled after the first horror movie and second action movie to find exactly what they want to do. But then you compare that to Mad Max, which had a recent movie come out, Fury Road, which was just,
amazing.
Yeah, which was just, critically successful, commercially successful, just awesome on every level. And so I'm just curious if anyone has any thoughts about was Mad Max able to create, a movie that everybody loves for its fourth movie, whereas Terminator and Aliens haven't.
Well, not everybody loved it. I mean, some MRAs were very upset.
Well, but maybe everybody loves is, taking it a bit too far, but you know what I mean? Like, that was commercially and critically successful at the highest level.
Right. Now, Fury Road was pretty, near universally beloved. It'd be in the top 5 movies of this decade on most people's lists.
And I mean, I would say that, there's probably a number of factors going in there, but certainly, the fact, one of the obvious differences to me is that the franchise was allowed to lie fallow for, 30 years. And, I know that was partly because George Miller was just having a really, really hard time getting Fury Road made, but it meant that certainly from a perception standpoint, that, that it was this thing that, people didn't feel like it had been sort of run into the ground, and then, they kept trying to like bring it back to life, but it was more, I didn't realize that Mad Max still had this life in it, but I'm not like tired of it. I don't feel like they've like explored these 10 million variations of it. It's just the first film in this franchise in 30 years. And then I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that, George Miller apparently, based on the Mad Max movies, George Miller is a genius. And so he brought the full, force of that, genius to bear. With the Alien movies, I think they've sort of, struggled with a number of different people, and even Ridley Scott, it seemed like he wasn't that interested in making an Alien movie. It just was like, why don't you set this in the Alien universe and make these other movies that interest you slightly more? And, and then with Terminator again, it's even in this case, Cameron was involved, and I think that helped the film, but it's not directed by him. I don't know for sure that, he could make a movie as good as T2, but I suspect that if it had just been Cameron writing and directing, it probably would have been better than this.
Well, I think
I
Anthony's...
blame marketing and the fact that people had Terminator fatigue from those 3 films that shall not be named. But I do think that I wasn't super impressed with the marketing. I was 100% signed on because Linda Hamilton was in it, and that is why we bought advance tickets and everything. But and when I heard it was a continuation of T2, those were my selling points. But I haven't seen any trailers that seemed interesting. I was worried about it.
That's funny.
For months.
Yeah, none of you liked the trailer, and I actually thought the trailer was pretty awesome. Like, we're talking about the one where, we first see the action sequence on the highway play out, and it's got that really solemn song in the background, like "I Am the Hunter" or whatever.
That was great. I actually really loved that. But I feel like that was more of the teaser.
Oh, I guess. But yeah, I like the teaser trailer a lot. I don't know if I saw the others. But to the points that you both just made, I think, for one thing, Fury Road was just lightning in a bottle. But beyond that, Anthony said, having the time off, because I think the problem with all these franchises is they kind of ebb and flow over the years. Predator, Terminator, Aliens, like some installments are better than others. But there is kind of just a general cynicism that underlies it all now. People are like, oh, geez, another one? Really? And it's too bad, because sometimes, Dark Fate is overall quite good, but it certainly was burdened with the weight of the failures of the other ones.
Well, did George Miller spend 30 years? I think this is true, right? He spent all that time refining the script for Fury Road, right? So, it's the exact opposite of the T3, let's write it in 2 weeks because we got greenlit or something. That probably makes a huge difference.
If you give anybody 30 years, to pursue something that they're actually passionate about, instead of just, well, this is my job and I need to make my house payments, that very cynical thing that we read, that the difference is pretty clear.
It was also just a stunning achievement. No one saw that movie coming. Essentially a 2-hour car chase. That was just the most gorgeous, ambitious thing. It's a miracle that got filmed. I don't think the studio had any idea what he was actually up to. That production took 2.5 years. He just,
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me read also this quote I came across. So, asked if there were disagreements in the edit, Cameron told Cinema Blends, "I would say many, and the blood is still being scrubbed off the walls from those creative battles. this is a film that was forged in fire. So yeah, but that's the creative process, right? This is about Terminator Dark Fate. I should have said that. But yeah, so there were apparently some serious disagreements between James Cameron, the producer, and Tim Miller, the director, on some of the, I don't know what, but some of the creative choices in this movie. And so that's probably, you know, that's a different situation than George Miller, Fury Road, where, yeah, you had 30 years to tweak it however you wanted.
What is Cameron doing right now? What's he working on?
Avatar
is he still working on Avatar
2 through 5.
Okay,
yeah. No, but I think
funny.
that
my favorite James Cameron film is Strange Days, which bombed at the box office, completely bombed. So, and Avatar is probably my least favorite, and that made just stupid amounts of money.
Strange Days was a really good flick. Whenever he and Bigelow work together, good stuff happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, I think they actually just started filming Avatars 2 and 3. I agree. I thought Avatar was fine, but I wouldn't have said that making 4 more or whatever is how James Cameron should devote the next 10 to 20 years of his life.
Yeah, Avatar was a great experience. I mean, it's like I saw it like 3 times in 3 different theaters just because the 3D was mind-blowing, but, who knows? I'll always give him the benefit of the doubt, but you'd think he could have maybe moved on to something else by now.
Well, he did the Battle Angel movie, which, as I said, was a great movie if it had come out in 1995.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he didn't direct that. That was Robert Rodriguez, I think, directed it.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It was a script that he actually did write in like 2000 or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to see the Cameron cut and the Miller cut, of Dark Fate, put them side by side. I mean, because they clearly have different sensibilities, and I think my gut instinct is to say the Cameron cut would be a lot better. I mean, with no disrespect to Tim Miller, but I think what's missing from Dark Fate, even in its final form, is the elegance of those first 2 films. It's just Cameron's got a very particular style that is timeless. You watch T2 today, it's as good as it was 28 years ago. Yeah, and
I feel like the Cameron cut, in my head, I imagine, is less goofy humor and more genuine human emotion. And I mean, Tim Miller is I thought the Deadpool movies were great, but he's a much less experienced director.
Right. And he didn't even do the second one. He just did the first one.
Okay, all right. But he's a much less experienced director even than James Cameron was when he made T2.
Right.
So,
although to be fair, James Cameron's most recent feature films as director, are Avatar and Titanic, neither of which I think acquit themselves particularly well when it comes to convincing human emotion.
Yeah, he has the George Lucas problem of he really needs to hire somebody else to write his dialogue. Like, when he was working with like Gale Ann Hurd and, people like that, he did better with this kind of thing. But I do think that Cameron is, because he's such a great visionary and he's good at this shit, he has a really hard time knowing where he needs help. And I think that he would be outstanding if he just had somebody else write his freaking dialogue.
I've always felt that way about Neil Blomkamp, but less so, admittedly, about Cameron. And this is the second time Titanic's come up. Are we not liking Titanic all of a sudden? What's happening here?
I love Titanic, and I feel very... I
mean, didn't we all cry like babies during that movie?
Hate it. Like, the dialogue is bad. It's an amazing movie if you watch it as a silent film. Like, literally, turn off... Because the visuals are amazing, the music is amazing. Just take off all the dialogue, and it's an amazing movie. However, again, the original script... Like, Rose was a cutter in that, and thank God that part got cut out. Thank you very much. Because that's just not Edwardian.
It's actually interesting. I don't know if this was the final script for Aliens, but one time I read the script for Aliens, and the dialogue was not that good. And I think Aliens has some of the best dialogue of any movie I've ever seen. And all the lines are, like, basically the same, but there's, like, a lot of extraneous stuff that got cut out. And I wonder, like, if someone else polished it up a little bit, or if the actors were kind of, ad-libbing a little bit. But yeah, I mean, so
it's got sore spots too. Like you've got the Game Over Man from.
That's a classic, Sarah.
That's great. I will defend that with my life.
All right, let's. We're almost out of time, so is there anything else? Let's focus here. Do you think that there will be another Terminator movie after Dark Fate? And if so, any thoughts on what direction it should take? Anthony?
I'm skeptical. I mean, I feel like if they try, I mean, I think to a certain extent there's this, studio conviction that there's something here and they have to just like figure it out. And at this point, I wonder if this is going to disabuse them of that notion, or if it doesn't, that potentially it becomes a TV series again. Because, I mean, not commercially speaking, but I think artistically, you could make a really strong case for the Sarah Connor Chronicles being the best continuation of the story. And, even leaving that aside, I think there's a sense just that, obviously a lot of IP and stuff is moving to TV as well. So if it were to come back, and I'm not necessarily convinced that it will, I think it might come back as a TV. I think the best thing to do would be to let it lie for a while, because even though I like Dark Fate, I think it's also perfectly fine as an ending, and, wait until somebody, probably not James Cameron because he's got other things to do, but somebody has the most amazing idea for a Terminator sequel, and then you can make it then, rather than just, cranking another reboot out in a few years.
Yeah, well, and also, like, I'm trying to think, like, Genesis was basically a reboot, like, this is basically a reboot, and so it's just, it's sort of disheartening to think, because I don't think that this, just from what I understand, it's not doing great. And I don't think there's going to be a direct sequel to this made, which means, to my mind, what's going to happen is in 5 years or something, they're going to reboot it again, and they're going to be like, people didn't like this Danny person, we're going to go back to John Connor, people love John Connor. And like, it's like, how many times can you, throw out what came before? And
they always take the wrong lessons from failures, like from box office failures. They always, it's like if a film with a female lead does poorly, well, I guess audiences don't like women. What the fuck? Why is that the takeaway?
Yeah, but so Sarah, what do you think is going to happen? What would you predict?
I mean, I think we can all agree that it just opened, literally this weekend, so we don't actually know the first weekend that it's open is so important for the overall arc of box office success, but you never know. I mean, it could pull through. People could have been distracted by Halloween.
Well, here's what we can kind of count on at this point. I mean, the last 3 installments all made around $400 million, and based on first weekend grosses, this is right in line with that. I mean, and there's a whole series of films like Star Trek, the recent Star Trek films, Alita, Tron Legacy, films that make $400 million and are deemed failures, and this is just going to be another one of those. And Hollywood has to figure out a way to make $400 million a viable amount of money again.
I think that the way that they might do that is practicing more restraint. I mean, honestly, we all agree that huge, most expensive scenes that were in this film
Have we mentioned we didn't like the plane? Let's just go back to that.
Yeah, we hate the plane. And all of that, all of that was the most expensive. And it took up a half an hour of the film. And nobody likes it. And it's like, come on, guys, like, stop getting so, I think this idea that, with especially male directors, I'm sorry, but they get really excited about just going, trying to top and trying to do what's been done before, but even bigger and better and more Michael Bay-ish. And I'm like, really? Are we still doing that in 2019? It's very upsetting.
Well, and particularly for Terminator, which to my mind, the power of the movies comes from the juxtaposition of these like creepy robots from the future against this totally believable everyday reality.
Yeah.
And when you make it
fucking factories.
Yeah, and when you make it like evil robots from the future in a sort of like a superhero milieu, it just doesn't work. It's like there's no contrast anymore.
Those minutes feel like a completely different film. Like it was distracting.
I just feel like it could have been, story-wise, I get it. They were trying to, have a respite, which was on the airplane, and that's nice to get them from point B to C. But, they could have just been condensed or, like, essentially cut out. Like, they're having plane troubles, they have to crash land, all of a sudden they're on the ground. You don't need to show us, like, 15 minutes of bouncing around the fuselage,
Yeah, or if you're going to do it, at least have a real plane, like in Dark Knight Rises, right? That was the one, right? Where like they actually filmed it on an actual plane, and it's freaking awesome, but it doesn't look like some like weird video game Polar Express like mashup.
Yeah, where everybody's bouncing against the walls of a fallen plane and still totally just getting slight small bruises, no big deal.
Yeah. All right, so we're out of time. So why don't we wrap things up there? Unless anyone have any final thoughts that they really want to get in here before we wrap this up?
Oh, I guess just in terms of the future, I think they're probably not going to do anything more with this. Even though it's an IP and studios always have that inclination to, at this point, I think it's the best ending we're going to get. And, we got James Cameron and Linda Hamilton and Arnold back for one last go at it. But what is there left to do, really,
Yeah. Sarah, final thought?
I totally agree with, the fact that I don't think they're going to do more if this doesn't kick up, financially. But I did love the final scene of Sarah Connor with Danny, and she's going off on her training. And I would totally love to have a film with those two, a buddy film. I think it's the last we'll see of Sarah Connor. But I wish that we could have that because I really loved, the women in this movie, and I love the characters, and I wanted more. And it's sad if, people don't go see this because then we won't get that, which we probably won't anyway, but.
Anthony, final thought?
I guess I would just say that probably my initial tweet about it being awesome slightly overstated things, but I think it's a pretty good Terminator sequel.
Yeah, I'm not sorry I saw it. I don't blame you too much for making me.
I think everyone should go see it. Thank you very much. And I totally agree with Anthony that it was awesome. So You stand by your initial reaction.
Yeah, stand by it.
You agree with past Anthony.
I love it. It is awesome. Go see it, everybody.
All right, cool. So let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Rafael Jordan. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Rafael Jordan for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.